First time we're reading from this book is called Unseen Forces by an author named Manly Palmer Hall. And this is on page 42. He's speaking about there are a certain number of people that when they die, depending on the circumstances in which they die, they may not be aware that they're dead. So their physical body, to all on the physical plane, is no longer functioning. But their soul and their spirit life, they have not reached the cognition or the consciousness of having died. But he says, for months after the close of World War I, soldiers on both sides who had died fighting still rose from the battlefield and fought in the ethers, wholly unconscious of the fact that they were dead. They maimed and destroyed each other, cursed and swore, and lived again among the bursting shells and shrapnel just as in former days. Still others wander among the forests of crosses in the great graveyards of Flanders and France, wondering after many years of death what has happened to them. The sea is still peopled with phantom ships whose crews, long since dead, still sail for the port which they were never able to reach alive. Among the ancient galleons on the etheric plain, the old Spanish buccaneer still counts his gold, tied by the bond of materiality and selfishness to the world of which he no longer is a part. The dope den is still peopled by the spirits of those who died slaves to its curse, and who come back again to inhale its fumes and live in its filth. Like great vampire bats, they seek to gratify again the passion of their former earth lives by seizing the minds and souls of the living and obsessing them still here. All of these facts teach a great lesson. The answer to the problem of the earthbound is twofold. The first is right living, and the second is non-attachment. Those who have done their best in this world need not worry, nor come back to beg forgiveness, nor haunt the footsteps of those they wronged, waiting for liberation. Those who are not attached to the things of this earth go straight about their master's business, and he says master referring to God, the Creator, in other worlds as well, and go on fulfilling their duty. Then again, if the people of this world would in spirit and in truth release the dead, they would not be surrounded by the spirits of those who wail and pray, held by a force they cannot understand. When we weep for the dead, when we long for them to come back, we draw them from the Master's work and surround ourselves with phantoms that can never return, but whom we can hold and divert from their life duty. This individual writes with a kind of authority that it resonates in my soul. And one might say, how else do you know if something's true unless it resonates in a certain way inside of you? I often speak about when somebody is lying, even though they may be very convincing in their lie, there's something inside that goes, I don't know why I don't feel right about this. And I believe it's because the truth has a certain vibrational quality, and deceit has another vibrational quality. And there is something very soothing about the truth. So when you hear it, it just feels right. It's hard to describe it beyond that. And when someone is being deceptive, there's something that makes your eyes squint and go, I don't know why, but. And I'd like you to trust that. You may find out later that you're wrong, and you may realize that you were wrong because of some sort of past filter in terms of how you've been lied to in the past and all that. But this is the way that we grow spiritually in perception, is that we have to trust something. Now, Manly Hall in his day was considered quite spiritually advanced, and he wrote a lot of books. And he honored God, as he called him, the Master, and he spoke a lot about man's quest to understand life. And he was able to, whether he experienced it or just understood it, I don't know, because he doesn't talk a lot about himself in his writing, but he explains one of these phenomena, which is when people die, we have a model in Christianity that says either you go to heaven or go to hell. That's a pretty extreme. But why does that exist? Well, the idea is if you follow right living, which he calls right living, but probably in Christian terms we would say you follow God's will or you try to do good, then when you die, you walk the pathway into heaven. And if you live the other way, oh man, you're in big trouble. I don't really resonate with that because there's something about it that doesn't, it feels more fear-driven to me, like you better live right here. Whereas what he's saying is, in certain instances, when people are, when they die in a shocking situation, like for example, they're in a wartime situation and they're alive and then 1 second they're dead, there's not an adjustment. You know, when you die of natural causes, you sort of feel that it's starting to come. And maybe for weeks you can go, I'm preparing. And if you've been around somebody who's dying and in their last few weeks, there are times when they're in and out of presence. So there's times where they're just sleeping or they're kind of staring off and they're not there. And you have a sense that maybe their soul is elsewhere. And then the soul comes back and there's a kind of a time to reconcile, time to talk to people, time to get your affairs in order. And then when you do die, you're kind of ready for it. That's my sense of when things go, you know, pretty much perfectly. Hopefully there's limited pain and suffering, but you can see it coming and you have a time. But in these situations where somebody is drowned at sea or they're in war, it's a very shocking change to all of a sudden be dead. And the problem is that in many instances, if people have not lived right living, and have been attached to their wealth, to their drugs, to their alcohol, to their sex, to whatever, they don't want to move on to the next phase. They're just still so enamored with whatever it is that they were trying to accomplish that they didn't accomplish. And so there's this state of being, this realm, some call it limbo, some call it a psychic realm, where you have souls that are wandering around unaware of where they're at in life. And this can go on for a long time because there has to be some sort of an awakening to realize. That's why we focus on getting that awakening as primed as we can while we're here on Earth, so we don't end up trapped in some kind of a limbo space, completely unconscious of where we are. So that's sort of a whole, you know, I find that stuff fascinating, but you know, that's not really the topic for today. I want to cover one other thing before we really get into the meat of it, which is, he says, if when your loved ones die, you are clinging to that memory, you know, there's so many people, they want to have a communication, they go to psychics and mediums and they want to communicate with the people who have passed on. And that creates an energetic tie for that individual, making it more difficult for them to move on to what they should be doing. And if that person happens to be attached to the earthly, then everybody's caught up in a kind of a spaghetti mess of sluggishness, instead of letting the spirit move on. How do we get to a phase where we can let the spirit move on? Well, we cultivate this energy of non-attachment. We know everybody, all of us are going to die at some point. And we're going to leave our children, or maybe our children will leave before us. And, you know, even in day-to-day life, you have friendships that you maybe thought were the be-all and end-all, and then at some point they faded, and now we don't have these people in our lives. It's particularly important that when somebody is passing on, that you can cherish the memory of the relationship and the kind of person. But we don't want you to, I don't want you to long for some connection with them as they are moving on. That's just not going to be helpful to them. And it's not really the spiritual path. Okay. Really what I want to open up, and this is what's going to lead into our next series in Wisdom School, is these two concepts of right living and non-attachment. Now when I was a kid, I went to this public school, and in the winter they would plow the snow from the schoolyard into this one corner and create a mountain. You know, and in Montreal we get a lot of snow. So sometimes it was late October, but certainly by November you had this mountain of snow in the corner. Now the school that I went to had sort of two neighborhoods that it served. One was the town of Mount Royal, where I was from, so we were the townies. And then the other was called Park Extension, and that was almost entirely a Greek population. Now, when you're 7, 8, 9, you have no idea why. Is there a Greek population in Park Extension? I don't know. But that wasn't what we thought about. We didn't sit there and ask each other, why are you here and why are you there? But, you know, in a sort of a normal cultural energy, the townies versus the Greeks was how we, you know, played on the mountain. And there was no racism and there was no weirdness. It was just, you know, they were more familiar with themselves and we were more familiar with ourselves, and it was fun. And at the beginning of school and at recess and at lunch, we'd have these monstrous battles. You know, it's like as soon as recess comes, we go scattering out, and whoever gets to the mountain first claims it, and then either the Greeks come up and try to take us off. And, you know, when you're 10 or 11 as a boy, it's very fun to be physical. Like to grab people and frickin' throw them off the mountain was awesome. You know, we tried not to hurt each other. We weren't punching each other. It was just like, you know, and then you'd come up and some guy would kneel behind you and someone would push you over, and it was so satisfying. You know, and really, I don't ever remember anybody getting hurt. You know, girls did not get involved in this. Occasionally when we were not doing it, they might play some game on the mountain. But it was too rough for girls of that age, you know. I mean, this is not a sexist thing, but this is just reality. Now, every time the bell rang for the end of recess, there was a sense of, oh, it was so good. It was so much fun because we were so engaged in the activity, you know, and it was a struggle. I mean, the Greeks were strong. They, you know, and like some days we might have people that our top guy was out sick or whatever, and it's like we were weakened and we were just like, we can't get anywhere. But it was so engaging. And I think about kids and how play just totally captures their energy and imagination. And then when the play has to end, like it's time for bed or they got to go back to class or whatever, we got to get on with things, you know, the party's over. There's this tremendous emotional angst. And the younger the kids are, oftentimes it can be, you know, calamitous. It's like putting them to bed is like you might as well just be executing them because they're going to miss out on the fun. The attachment, that's what happens. When you're engaged in something and it's good, you want it to keep going. There's nothing wrong with that. That is not attachment. That is what we seek, the experience of connection, either in an activity or with other people. You know, like when you're in love with your partner and you can just hang out for hours and hours at a time and you want to be close to them and you don't want it to end and stuff. That's a beautiful thing. But there's a consciousness that you have to maintain, which is as long as it's here and it's happening, it's vital, it's great. But I don't know when it's going to end. But I can guarantee you, likely, not that necessarily the relationship is going to end, but this form of the connection is going to change. You know, like I'm sure when we became 12 and 13, it wasn't as compelling for us to throw each other off the mountain because we had outgrown that level of play. And now, you know, you start to become interested in girls and you want to look, you know, cool, and so it's not as cool to do that. But when you're 10 or 11 and somebody says, you know, in 2 years you're going to be totally bored with this activity, you're like, you're out of your mind. I'm never going to be tired of frickin' throwing the Greeks off the mountain. So you have to cultivate, I'm going to encourage you to cultivate a non-attachment. And what that means is not that I become aloof and distant and I don't engage. It's that I realize that even if I get completely involved and engaged and I'm just so in love with what I'm doing, it's going to end. An element of it is going to transition into something else. That is just, you know, it's like they say, the only constant is change. So everything is on a life cycle like that. So when people that you love are going to die, and you are given fair warning because they're sick and we all know, okay, they got cancer or they're old age or something is saying this is, I think, the twilight of their life, then do what you can to resolve that relationship while it's still possible. In the same way, if you have friendships here on the earth plane and it feels like they're starting to, you know, wobble, meaning the connection is no longer solid, you can either try to resuscitate it or you can move into a state of letting it go. We don't want to be pining and harboring wistfulness, you know, 10 years after for something that didn't work out. So we have to learn this maturing emotionally. And then, of course, when you do pass over, you don't want to get caught up in this kind of a limbo state where you don't really know where you're at. And I think that's relatively easy to avoid. I can't say specific for sure, but I think if you know this now, there's no reason that in the moment when you've passed on, the consciousness doesn't come to you. Like, okay, what am I supposed to do? Oh, yes, I'm supposed to move towards the light. That's kind of the easiest clue. And most people who have had near-death experiences, who've left their bodies and have entered into some sort of a spiritual experience, talk about that. Either somebody is beckoning them, this is where you go, and that being feels full of love and benevolence, and sometimes it looks like it's a familiar person. And you go. Now, if you're a completely distrustful person and you're like, well, I'm still clamoring for my drug fix and all that, then you probably don't want to go there. You're going like, this is what I need to do now. So we want to be as clear as we can. Right living. Right living will help you avoid a tremendous amount of angst. That is, angst is abundant upon the planet. My point is that even if you live to the letter of the law that Jesus taught, you're going to have challenges in dealing with human beings because that's just where we're at right now. People are not as considerate as you would like them to be. You're probably not as considerate as others may want you to be in certain areas, and on and on and on. But when you are encouraged to find out what is right living, and you make it a priority, a tremendous amount of the surprises that create this sort of Murphy's Law attitude on the earth will go away completely. And what I mean by that is that you're not going to have to worry about, getting this crazy bill in the mail, or you're going to have this horrible calamity happen to you. There may be loved ones in your lives who are not following right living, and they're getting into trouble. I've shared with you that I worked in prisons in Illinois for 4 years. I was counseling individual prisoners that were, they were going to probably get out within a year. And there were other times where they were going to be in for longer, but I was trying to bring some consciousness to them. And many of them were remorseful. And the ones who were coming to a Christian-type event, they did believe in God, and they understood that they had crossed a line and they were having to pay for it. And that's a really important step. But in investigating, their story, you really start to go, oh, you made bad decisions here. Like, you could have done this and you didn't do that. And, sometimes they might be, well, that was my only choice. And I'm always like, no, that's not. It's never your only choice to do the wrong thing. And we try to uphold a very high standard here. I encourage you to live at a very high standard of rightness. This is different than self-righteousness, which you project outwards and you find fault with everybody not doing it the way you think they should be. Forget about that. I'm talking about being considerate to others. I'm talking about paying your bills on time. I'm talking about not complaining and rebelling against things by being slack on them, by complaining about things and, and not attending to them. Because when you don't attend to things, let's imagine you don't clean your house for 2 months, right? And even if you live alone. Like, it's just going to get dusty, and it's going to, if you're using the bathroom every day, it's just going to start to look kind of gross. And yet, you could say, well, I really didn't do anything. I didn't have any parties. I'm trying to keep it. But you have to attend to things and freshen them up. And when you do this spiritually as well, so you got to attend to your emotions. If you're getting pulled down or something, you've got to get there quickly. And go, okay, I don't want to get pulled down, because sometimes you start to go, I now live at this low energetic place because I'm just generally depressed and bummed out. And then you start to go lower because, take a look at a house that nobody's lived in for a year. You've got animals that have come in, and there's all sorts of decay happening because there's no energy of love that's moving into it. We're going to talk a lot in the coming months about right living. And I think the basic stuff, following the 10 Commandments, is not an issue for us. I don't feel like we are tempted to go out and do some of those things. But the subtlety of right living, which is going to raise your consciousness and just relieve you of this tremendous concern about these calamities that you were talking about. There's no reason to catastrophize when you are following right living, because you understand the karmic laws Catastrophe does just not randomly happen. Sometimes, yeah, you know, someone might get caught up in the crossfire of a drunk driver or something like that, you know, and all of a sudden their life is really dramatically changed. I don't know if there's that much you can do to prevent that kind of thing. But there's a tremendous amount you can do to prevent the bulk of catastrophes that the mind wants to come up with. And I would like you to be free of that. I feel mostly free of it. I mean, I really don't, even if I thought about something really, really, you know, tragic, all of a sudden there's a hurricane and my house is destroyed, would I be able to figure out the next step? Yeah, you know. So the right living is tied to the non-attachment. If you want things not to change and you're clutching them, then you're brittle. You know, and that brittleness means that when a storm comes, you're knocked to pieces. So do your best to investigate, you know, how might I raise the standard of my timing and things, my financial approach to things, my consideration of others, my boundaries for those who are, you know, sucking energy from me, et cetera, et cetera. You begin to examine and you begin to make those adjustments.